Brothers and sisters, it's my privilege to introduce to you a new series that we're going to be doing. Over the last year, one series that we did was looking at sort of the middle section of Luke and seeing the various ways that the various teachings of Jesus, his parables, some of the events that happened while he was traveling around the country. And today we're going to begin a series of looking in the book of Luke at the end of Jesus' life, at the last 2 chapters of the book of Luke, with Jesus' trial, his death, and his resurrection as we get ready for Easter and reflect upon Easter, the celebration of Jesus' resurrection. So as we go through this season, we're going to jump in next week to looking at the trial of Jesus before the Jewish leaders. But as we do so, I want to give some context as to why we're here, why we're there, why was Jesus arrested in the first place. It's part of the whole book of Luke. The first 3 chapters really sort of talk about the preparation for ministry. This is where we have the Christmas story and John the Baptist's birth and his early ministry and so on. And chapters 4 through 9 are Jesus' early ministry in Galilee. But really some events happen in chapter 9, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And Luke shifts his focus in the book to pointing towards the fact that Jesus is going to Jerusalem, that is his ultimate destination. And so then we get to chapter 19 and we find Jesus entering Jerusalem a week before he is going to die. And as he enters Jerusalem in triumph with crowds shouting praise of him, he comes into Jerusalem and kicks out the people that are selling in the temple, and he spends a week teaching there in the temple. He is there for that week, and then the religious leaders have him arrested. In chapters 19 through 22, we have the details of 22 through 24, we have the details of Jesus' arrest, his trial. We have his death on the cross. And then chapter 24 tells us a lot about his resurrection and his appearances to his disciples afterwards. As we look at the book of Luke and why Jesus was arrested in the first place, we really need to look at 2 different types of motivations. One is the motivation of the religious leaders, because they're the ones that are going to be the drivers of Jesus being captured, arrested, and put to death. However, we're also going to see that actually Jesus' motivation is far more important, that Jesus is not a passive player here. It's not just that these things are being done to him, but he is actively involved in a sense in what's going on, that he has planned and prepared for this. And this is a critical thing for us to understand about these scriptures. So we're going to briefly look at sort of from a human perspective. If people or historians today were to go back and look at why Jesus was arrested, I think that these are generally the reasons that would probably be given. We would look at the ways that he ran afoul of the religious leaders, ways in which he opposed the systems of authority that were in place, and the result of that is that he was arrested and put to death. So there are a number of places when Jesus is teaching that he has some disagreements with the Pharisees, but really this is the most striking one here in chapter 11, that while Jesus was speaking, a Pharisee asked him to dine with him, so he went in and reclined at table. The Pharisee was astonished to see that he did not first wash before dinner. And the Lord said to him, "Now you Pharisees cleanse the outside of the cup and of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness." These are not nice words, and so as a result he was offended. Actually, Jesus goes on quite a bit more than this about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. And so the lawyers that are there, now the lawyers are experts in the Mosaic law, so they are supposed to give judgments about what is or is not permissible to do. One of the lawyers answered him, "Teacher, in saying these things you insult us also." And Jesus didn't go, "Oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to insult you, it was just the Pharisees." Actually, Jesus sort of doubles down and he said, "Woe to you lawyers also." And he goes on to criticize these lawyers, these scribes, for their choices as well. The result of this then is what comes next. As he went away from there, the scribes and the Pharisees began to press him hard and to provoke him to speak about many things, lying in wait for him to catch him in something he might say. So now they're looking to discredit Jesus. They have decided that Jesus is not someone that they are going to cater to, not someone that they are going to promote, but on the contrary, that he is someone they are going to oppose, that he's someone that they're going to try to persuade the people that this guy isn't a good guy. Now, when Jesus comes to the temple is really where we have see his first interactions with the Sadducees. The Pharisees were one of the party of religious Jews. They believed in all the Old Testament law and the prophets, all the Old Testament scriptures. They believed in the resurrection from the dead. They were really much closer to the truth. The Sadducees were a sect that controlled the temple because they included the priests and the high priests and so on. And they only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they rejected the idea of the resurrection from the dead. There are a number of wrong teachings that they had, but they are really the ones with the power and with the connections to the Roman governorship. But when Jesus enters Jerusalem in chapter 19, he says he drives out those who sold, which is such an understated thing. Really, this would have been in this large courtyard in the outer part of it, the place that was designated for Gentiles, for non-Jews to be able to worship. This would have been a busy scene with lots of animals, doves, sheep, goats, and so on, which would be acceptable sacrifices so that pilgrims could come and buy their sacrifices right there to be able to be offered at the temple. There were money changers because you had to buy these animals with temple coins, and so you had to pay a fee to exchange your regular money for temple money. And all of these things meant that there was a lot of profit going into the pockets of the Sadducees and of the temple. And Jesus comes in and completely disrupts that commerce. He throws out those who are doing this, and he tells them, "My house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." And he was teaching daily in the temple. So, like I say, there's not a whole lot given in terms of what Luke says to give us a clue, but we can sort of read between the lines and see why the religious leaders then opposed him. It says the chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people were seeking to destroy him, but they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were hanging on his words. So they're actually looking to destroy him. Maybe to discredit, in any event, to reduce his influence there. After all, this is the Passover week. This is probably one of the highest profit weeks for that business that was going on in the temple. And also, he was opposing their authority. They were the ones that were supposed to be in charge of the temple, but when Jesus casts people out and then spends his time teaching there, they can't effectively control that space. And so we shouldn't be surprised that they want to destroy him. In chapter 22, they find a way. It says, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover, and the chief priests and scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd." In other words, they wanted to get rid of him, but they couldn't just go and arrest him because he had a sympathetic crowd around him all the time. So Judas agrees to find for them some time when Jesus is not going to be surrounded by a sympathetic crowd, and they'll pay him money to do so. And so the result of this is that when Jesus has had his Last Supper, when he has gone to the Garden of Gethsemane where he spent the night, as he usually did, so Judas knew the spot, Judas has gone and gotten a bunch of thugs of muscle from the religious leaders, and he's going to come and arrest him. While he was still speaking to the disciples, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. So in a sense, our answer to our question that we started off with, why was Jesus arrested, is very simple and straightforward. Like so many other religious leaders, prophets, wise men, and revolutionaries before him, Jesus has opposed the power structures of the day. They, being offended, hurt, or afraid, have decided they're going to get rid of him, and so that's exactly what they do. But actually, if you notice in those passages, we rarely see much explanation of why they opposed him so much. It's usually stated very simply and baldly that they decided that they were going to oppose Jesus. Why was it that they were opposed to him? Actually, the book of Luke isn't so interested in the question of why the Pharisees and the leaders wanted to oppose Jesus. Luke is more interested in Jesus' reason for going to the cross. And actually, throughout the book, he frequently points to the fact that Jesus is the one who is planning on going to Jerusalem, who is planning on being arrested and suffering and so on. We're going to look at chapter 9 and see this is coupled to his identity. Jesus makes more statements on his way to Jerusalem. As Jesus is preparing for his death, he continues to talk about the fact that he's going to die. Then after the resurrection, he frequently reminds his disciples that this is what he was planning all along. So in chapter 9, this is really where our change kicks off. Jesus has been doing ministry in Galilee. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Who do people say that I am?" And they go, "Well, they kind of say this or that." And then he turns to them and says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter comes out with this great statement, which is that you are the Christ of God. Now, this term, the Christ, is the same as the word Messiah, which also means anointed one. And this has deep and rich meaning from the Old Testament. Many passages speak about God's anointed, and many passages that don't use that phrase were already understood by the Jewish people of Jesus' day to be referring to this anointed one, Messiah. That is, he was one who was designated by God who would deliver the Jewish people, who would bring them out of exile, in effect, and bring them into a position of power, influence, wealth that they had previously, perhaps, but to an even greater degree than they ever had, even under David and Solomon. And so this statement that he is the Christ, many people had claimed to be Christ, but Jesus here accepts that statement that Peter makes about him, that he is the Christ, the Messiah of God. And then he immediately turns around, you can see it's just 2 verses later, and says, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the 3rd day be raised." Jesus' identity as the Messiah is deeply tied to the fact that he has to go and do these things, to suffer, to be betrayed, etc., to be killed. All of these things are tied to the fact that he is the Messiah. He knows the disciples don't get that yet. When they see Messiah, when they see anointed, they're thinking success, victory, defeat of our enemies. But Jesus is saying this is what Messiah looks like. And it doesn't stop there. Right after that, Jesus goes up on this mountain with Peter, James, and John, and there he is transfigured. That is, he looks different. He is glowing and bright, and Moses and Elijah are there with him. They're talking about Jesus' upcoming exodus, or departure is the word that's used, probably referring to Jesus' ascension that he's going to accomplish. That's sort of the last event that happens in the book of Luke, and it's the first event in Luke's sequel, which is called Acts. And Jesus is talking with them about that. And then there's a voice from heaven that says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." So he is not only declared to be the Messiah, he not only accepts that, but there's a voice from heaven affirming that Jesus is God's Son. This is tremendous. And as they come down the mountain, there's a further confirmation, because there's this demon-possessed man whom no one can cast the demon out of. But when Jesus comes, he casts him out immediately. And everyone is marveling. Everyone is amazed. Everyone is in awe. They're saying, wow, the kingdom of God is here. We're seeing it right now. It's about to come to pass. And he turns to his disciples and says, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. Jesus knows that his identity as the Son of God, his power over demons, does not change the fact that he is about to be delivered into the hands of men. In fact, he knows that this is further confirmation that this is what needs to happen. And so we aren't surprised when just a few verses later, Luke says, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And the rest of chapters 10 through until he arrives in Jerusalem are described as being part of his journey there, even though some of those events didn't happen during his last trip there, as we know from some of the other Gospels. Luke presents it to us in that sort of framework so that we understand that Jesus' ministry is pointing him to Jerusalem. I'm always saddened when I hear sometimes of people who say that they are red-letter Christians. There's a phrase that comes from back in the day when, actually even today, many Bibles are printed with Jesus' words in red. And they say, you know, unlike those people that focus on the books of Paul or focuses on Jesus' death and resurrection, I care about what Jesus said while he lived. And I think that's absolutely great that we focus on what Jesus said. If we claim to follow Jesus and we don't care about what he said, we don't pay attention to what he said, then we are not only fools, but we are misrepresenting our Lord if we aren't following what he says. But to ignore the fact that Jesus' ministry on earth was pointed to what would happen in Jerusalem, to his death, to his betrayal, that's to misunderstand Jesus' fundamental purpose as he describes it for himself. We won't take the time to read through these, but there are other places while Jesus is journeying to Jerusalem where he makes reference to the fact that he is going to go and die there. And just before he gets to Jerusalem, we read in chapter 18, "And taking the 12, he said to them, 'See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles, and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spit upon, and after flogging him, they will kill him, and on the third day he will rise.' But they understood none of these things." Now, this is such important stuff. It's critical for us to understand that Jesus knows exactly what's going to happen when he goes to Jerusalem, and that is why he's going to Jerusalem. He has set his face to go there. And so we have a few other passages before Jesus is arrested where he makes reference to his death and his impending arrest. And then after his resurrection, there's frequent references back to the fact that this was planned in advance. The angels, when they're speaking to the women at the tomb, at the empty tomb, says to them, "He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise." And then they remembered his words. As Jesus meets with two disciples on the way to Emmaus, he is astonished that they don't understand that this is what had to happen. He says, "O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And then later on, he meets with his disciples in the upper room and he says, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." And then he underlines that point yet again in the following verses. The point of all of this is that Jesus has tied his identity to the fact that he has to go to Jerusalem. He has to be arrested. He has to suffer. He has to be killed. And then he has to rise from the dead. And ultimately, he has to ascend once again to the Father. This is Jesus' trajectory, and he has planned it from the beginning. Why is this so important? Well, Jesus describes it as important. He says, it is a necessity. He says the Son of Man must suffer. I must go on my way. He must suffer many things. The Son of Man must be delivered. He says, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer? Repeatedly, we see that Jesus sees this as an imperative, not an option, not something that could happen or something that maybe would happen, but that's something that had to happen. And how did he know that it had to happen? Because it was written in the scriptures. And this is in multiple passages. I'm showing here 3 verses and here another 2 where Jesus emphasizes over and over that all of this was described beforehand. It was in the Old Testament. It was in the Jewish scriptures, which his disciples and all of the rest of his culture had available to them. That this is what had to happen to the Christ. The consequence of this is that Jesus, we find, was going to be arrested. And that arrest was not a result of human forces at work, but rather it was part of God's plan. Jesus was aligning himself with the plan of his Father. He was aligning himself with that will as it had been revealed in the Old Testament scriptures. Jesus was planning on this because he was obedient to his Father. Everything that happened to Jesus was a part of God's plan, not as a result of human doing. Now, I'm not trying to say that God was the one who caused the religious leaders to arrest Jesus. I'm not saying that God caused Judas to betray Jesus, but rather what I'm saying is that God used everything that was happening and he used it for his purpose and for his glory. There's a number of really important lessons that we learn from this. The first is that God is in charge, not mankind. And this ties so much into what we've been seeing in the book of Revelation. In chapters 2 and 3, as we've looked at the churches, repeatedly we are warned that we should trust in God, that we should look to be overcomers, by which he doesn't mean that we triumph over the difficulties of this life by having success, but rather what he means is that you have held on to the faith. That so much of the world wants to tell us that you are a people without power. You are a people who should compromise, that you should make do and just sort of, blend into the world around you, lest you draw the wrath or the ire of the people around you. And God says repeatedly, Jesus repeatedly says to the churches, that he will give gifts to those who overcome. That is, those who hold on to the faith, who believe that God's will is being done and not man's. And that even if men seem to triumph, even if evil men seem to be triumphing, if it looks like the people with the money and the power and the right color skin and the right nationality, if they are the ones that are winning everything, God is still in charge. Second, it points us to the fact that Jesus' death and resurrection are the most important points of the book. There's a lot of the book of Luke that talks about Jesus' ministry, his healings, his deliverance from demons, the fact that his teachings, his parables, all of these are incredibly important. And if we're going to be followers of Jesus, we have to pay attention to that. But Luke is pointing us to the fact that this is the most critical part of the book. If we don't get why Jesus died, why he was raised to life, then we have missed the point of this book. It's not really what this sermon about, but just in case any of you listening don't know why. Why was it necessary that Jesus die on the cross? I'll just point you to something that I think is going to come up repeatedly over the next weeks, which is that mankind is sinful, that we are broken, that we have abandoned God, and as a result, we deserve eternal condemnation. Not because everyone is as bad as they could be. Perhaps you're a great moral person, maybe a nicer person than some Christians you know. But God says that everyone who sets their heart on their own way, on their own path, who wants to define their own life instead of submitting to God's plan for them, these people have rejected the rightful lordship of God over them and are deserving of death. But he sent Jesus to take that sin, that penalty upon himself. God offers us the opportunity to die with Christ and to be raised with him by identifying ourselves with him, by claiming him as our Lord, by choosing to be represented by him instead of Adam who sinned before us. God invites us into a relationship of forgiveness, a relationship that is restored, that is whole. And if that seems too good to be true, I encourage you to speak with any of the elders or other ministry leaders in the church. If you don't know any, feel free to reach out to us either through the secretary or directly from elders@gracefellowship.qa. We would love to chat with you more about that. So this is the most critical part of the book, and we cannot lose sight of that. The third main reason why I think Luke focuses in on the fact that God is the one who's in charge here is that we need to understand that this calamity that happens, that this good man is going to die, is not an accident, but it is in fact the very intention of God. It is the very intention of Jesus Christ himself that this should happen. Because otherwise what we have is a tragedy, and we have God's plans upset, or God saying, oh man, these people killed my guy, I guess I'd better raise him from the dead. No, this was always God's plan. And the last point that I really want to focus on today is that God uses evil for good. God uses evil for good, not just in Jesus' life, but in our lives also. Lest you think that maybe after Jesus, now all believers who follow him should expect to have good lives instead, that only Jesus had to suffer and the rest of us can have the good life, I'll point you to just a few verses here. For instance, 1 Peter 4, since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same way of thinking. As we see this in the context, it's clear he's saying, look, you have to understand that if the person that we're following suffered, we should expect that we will be suffering as well if we follow him. And in James chapter 1, we have this strange statement. He says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Do you want to be perfect and complete? Do you want to be lacking in nothing? There's only one way to do that. And that's to have steadfastness. And the only way to have steadfastness, to endurance, is to be tried and succeed, and tried and succeed, and tried and succeed. That every time we go through a trial and we respond in faith rather than in apathy or trying to seek our own way out of the situation, out of the difficulty, and trusting in God's deliverance instead, every time we do that, we build endurance, which will build in us perfection and completion. In Romans 5:3, he says effectively the same thing. We rejoice in our sufferings because suffering produces endurance, and that endurance ultimately leads to hope, and a hope that won't be disappointed because God is the one who's going to deliver us. I want to leave you then with Romans chapter 8, 28 to 30, which is a very familiar passage for many of you. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he may be the firstborn among many brothers. Now, some people have misinterpreted, I think, especially the first verse here, to mean that, you know what, if you didn't get the promotion today, it means that there's a better job around the corner for you tomorrow. That if you just have faith in God, you're going to see something even better than the disappointment that you've gone through. And that's really not what he's saying here. He tells us what God's purpose is, how God defines for our good in this second verse. For those whom he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. To follow God is that we desire to be made in the image of his Son. This one who was perfectly loving, perfectly just. This one who came and sacrificed himself for all of mankind, not only on the cross, but also even in his choice to spend 30 years on this earth. In so many ways, Jesus is exactly the sort of person that I want to be. And it's challenging, and sometimes it takes a little courage to want to be like Jesus, because Jesus had a life that included suffering, and we should expect the same ourselves. But God is promising us that when we go through difficult things, that all things work together to build us into the image of his Son. He is the perfect Father who knows exactly the environment that we need to be built up into the image of his Son, that we can become like Jesus. Brothers and sisters, maybe you're looking at the difficulties in your life and you're saying, you know, I don't think God could, that doesn't really seem to apply to my situation. You don't understand, I have cancer. But God took an even more terrible death than cancer and turned it for good when Jesus died on the cross. Perhaps you say, you know, you don't understand that the difficulty that I'm in right now is because of the evil that other people have done to me. Because my spouse has cheated on me, that is why I am suffering right now. Because someone else ran the red light, that's why I'm in the hospital right now. Because someone else stole my paycheck and refused to give me my right wages, that's why I'm suffering right now. How could God turn their evil for good? But God took the evil that was done by these chief priests, by these elders, by Judas who betrayed Jesus. He took that evil and he used it for good. If the betrayal of the Son of God can be used for his glory and his purposes, I can guarantee you that the evil being done to you by others right now can also be used by God for glory. But perhaps you're saying, yeah, but you don't understand. It's my own sin. My own sin has caused these problems. That I cheated on my wife. That I ran through the red light. That I lied on my tax forms and so I'm in prison or in threat of a fine. Yes, it's true. Those probably are your fault. But it doesn't change the fact that if God can use the sins of the chief priests and the elders and he can use that for good, why do you think that your sin is some special case that God can't use for good? God can use all sin for good. Now, the chief priests suffered for their sin, and those who sin upon this earth will reap the consequences of it. All except those that are covered by the blood of Jesus, because they have accepted him as their Savior. So I encourage you today to look at the difficulties in your life and understand that you can hold fast to God. That there is no suffering that has come upon you, but that God will use it for good. If the most heinous crime in the history of humanity, to take the only truly innocent person and put him to death, as we'll see, they really put him to death for being who he really is, the Son of God. If they take the righteous Son of God and put him on the cross, if that can be used for good, then I assure you that all the trials and temptations and difficulties of this world can and will be used by God for His glory, for your growth, for that which is ultimately good in this life. And we will enjoy those benefits for eternity.